Jane Joyner, who's a climate story consultant and the founder and director of Good Energy. With over 15 years of experience in climate communications, she's driven by a passion for storytelling and helping people find courage in the face of climate change. So Anna Jane, you want to come on up? We also have Dr. Gisela Winkler, who's a Lamont Research Professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, where she also serves as the Associate Director of the Geochemistry Division. That's a lot of titles, Gisela. Come on up. She's a climate scientist and isotope geochemist interested in climate change and biogeochemical cycles. Wowza. We also have Shanara Sunderlal, who is the Education Outreach Manager at the Billion Oyster Project. Such a cool New York-based nonprofit. I encourage you to check out their social media. She is an environmental educator, birder, and budding wildlife photographer with an MA focused on environmental conservation education from NYU. From the Barnard ranks, we have Danny Rivera, a sophomore at Barnard College. She's a youth climate organizer and has worked with groups like Extinction Rebellion Youth US and the Sunrise Movement. Our last but certainly not least, student climate organizer Magnolia Mead, 19-year-old environmental justice activist whose work focuses on building youth power for government action on climate change. Originally from Ithaca, Magnolia now lives in Washington, D.C., where she's pursuing a dual MA-BA degree in political communication at American University. And I am so delighted to introduce our moderator, my dear friend Vanessa Fagens-Turner, who is a climate leader and ocean enthusiast. She's the executive director of Bank FWD, an organization accelerating climate action by the banking sector. She's a principal with Investable Oceans, a fundraising platform, and an advisor to the city of Ithaca's nation-leading Green New Deal. So I'll give you this mic, and everybody, round of applause for an incredible panel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's particularly special to watch this film on the literal eve of the United Nations signing of a historic treaty to protect 30% of the world's oceans in marine reserves by 2030. Check this out and make sure to be following along. It's a fantastic time to be here. This film really highlights the crux of the challenge we face when trying to win hearts and minds of people to inspire more climate action. And because this is a film about the ocean principally as a lens into the environmental conservation conversation, I'll quote an oft over-quoted phrase from Jacques Cousteau to say, people protect what they love what they understand, and they understand what they are taught. And so with that frame, we think of each of our panelists here as teachers as well as activists who intrinsically understand the importance of combining education, outreach, and advocacy. And with that, I thought we would go down the line and ask everybody about the kind of audience or audiences you traditionally engage with and are trying to teach. And to kick things off, a bit of a story about a particular breakthrough moment, an example when you thought your messaging really struck home. Why don't we start at the end with AJ, with Anna Jane, and who I have had the pleasure of knowing for almost 10 years, since she was the star in a climate documentary called Years of Living Dangerously. Anna Jane.
Thank you so much for having me. That story really got me because I live on the water and was also swimming at 18 months old. So I started a nonprofit called Good Energy, which works with screenwriters and other industry creatives to acknowledge climate change more often on screen and to tell more stories where climate is a big part of the focus. We did some research with USC's Media Impact Project, and between 2016 and 2020, only 2.8% of scripted television and film acknowledged climate change even in passing. So we are trying very hard to change that, and this is a really good example of why, because it moves you emotionally in ways that so many other forms of communications can't.
Thank you. We'll go on to Gisela and then down the line, please.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. This was a beautiful movie, really enjoyed it. My audience, I guess that was your first question, is actually a very classical one. I teach at Columbia, mostly undergraduates, and I teach them about the climate system. And I think the most meaningful moments for me are when I manage to actually get that message across without going into the nitty-gritty of science and of sort of the boringness of science, but when I can actually convince the students that the problem that we are facing is pretty simple and straightforward and not very complicated, and so are the solutions. And there is these moments where I have undergrads who are really not into science, who sort of get that and catch that, and that's very meaningful to me. That's sort of my favorite experience as a teacher.
For me, hi everybody, thanks for having me as well. So my audience is between kindergarten to adults. I do teach the public as well. So with that in mind, I do mostly spend most of my time around children, and I see them maybe like, once in their year, in the school year, so I don't get to see the large impact in a lot of ways. I usually have 3-minute elevator pitch with public as well, so it's hard to get that like aha moment that's like more evergreen, but I do, those moments where you can just get a kid to get dirty, get their hands dirty in the Hudson water, and get them to be like, oh, this is actually pretty cool, like there's actually life in here. That is always a good moment. And then past that, I think something that's a breakthrough for me is when I can inspire somebody to consider being in the environmental field, whether it's in the engineering side, environmental engineering, or public policy, whatever it might be, kind of shared with you, get them to be like, there's a track here and it is attainable. Those are definitely the ones that stick with me most.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I would say my audience is probably other people around my age, other college students and high schoolers, with the end goal of getting the attention of politicians and people in power. And a standout moment for me was the first protest that I co-organized with my friends in the Sunrise Movement back in 2020. It was actually in my hometown, Elizabeth, New Jersey, which faces some instances of environmental racism, and it was really powerful. I was able to talk with my friends that I grew up with in elementary and middle school and kind of reflect about the experiences we grew up with, and then stand on the steps of our county courthouse and protest and get attention. So yeah.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. I think that one of the major themes in the film was how when you're bringing demands in the environmental movement to people in power and policymakers, we come up against a lot of resistance, and I focus a lot on not just organizing youth to build power and show political power and demand climate action, but also bringing those decisions to leaders in Congress, the state level, and I think it can be really discouraging as a climate activist coming up against that threat, but as youth, we really bring a powerful message because we're the embodiment of the future. We should be studying for our classes, and instead we're choosing to dedicate a lot of our free time to this work, and that's really powerful, and it's so important to be highlighting those voices when we're bringing that to leaders, and I do think that it's making change.
So already here we can see what a range of educators and advocates we have for the environment, and maybe I'll take a little bit of moderator's prerogative here to push a little more with Anna Jane, given that I know a bit more about your background here, and perhaps you could say a bit about the audience you began organizing with to give context for yet another group here and demographic that we haven't heard represented.
Yeah, so as Vanessa knows well, my father is a prominent evangelical megachurch pastor, so I started my career primarily organizing faith communities. Started with college students and worked my way up to a range, which is what the story that was told on Years of Living Dangerously was trying to convince my father that climate change is real. You'll have to go watch it to see what happens. But yeah, so that is, and oftentimes people ask me what's the through line between organizing faith communities to, working within Hollywood and writers, and really, religion is a set of stories. And so I just kind of inherently knew growing up in that space how powerful stories are and how much they can change the world around you for better and good. And aside from religion, Hollywood is our most powerful storyteller, and it seems like a huge gap that there is not more climate in those stories.
Thank you for indulging me on that one. I think I'm going to then sort of reflect back on the film as we talk about what this storytelling looks like, and as we see what a range of voices and approaches are represented here. The mother and the daughter have very different approaches in this film to trying to communicate their experience. And as we know in the world, very few people have the type of access and opportunity to get to know the environment, to get to love it the way Cousteau would like and the people in the film would like, that they have had. So when trying to communicate this, the mother is a bit more an emotional appeal. The daughter tries to bring science and data and research into the mix. As you approach your storytelling, perhaps you can give a bit of an example of how you think about this mix and perhaps where it is you are pushing your comfort zones to communicate across boundaries. Let's start this time with Magnolia, and we'll go down the line.
So I think that two kind of approaches you were talking about, one being the emotional aspect and the storytelling aspect, and then the other being more of a data science approach. Both are absolutely needed in these advocacy spaces. We can bring data and facts and present these to people in power and lawmakers, and they'll still deny us action, even when confronted with the facts. And often it's actually the personal stories that really appeal and change people's hearts and minds. But it's also, it's important to have both. I one time was speaking with a conservative climate activist, and often people like to claim that solutions like the Green New Deal or like climate action that's been passed in Congress is radical, or we don't need it, it's too much. And sometimes you just need to pull out a number and tell them, well, this many people support it, and this is what it's going to cause emissions-wise. So I would absolutely say, both are super needed.
That was on CNN, by the way, where she was speaking with that activist, and when she pulled out the number about the percentage of people who supported the bill, he didn't have a good response. Danny.
Yeah, so I would say that both the emotional and I guess the more scientific or logical side of climate action is necessary because the climate crisis covers our entire lives. It's such a wide scope of an impact. And I would say, at least in my organizing work, I probably lean into the emotional side a bit more. I was an organizer with Extinction Rebellion Youth US for around 2 years, and something that really stuck out with me with their work is how often they turn to like theatrics and the arts, and I grew up in the arts, so that it's something that just really resonates with me and is a way that I express myself a lot. So seeing these big campy costumes and having, I guess, more extreme versions of nonviolent direct action, I think is really necessary and can often seem a little silly, but I think it communicates the importance and the urgency of our current climate crisis. And then I would say for the scientific side of it, or the more factual based approach, I'm happy to be a student here at Barnard studying urban studies, and hopefully from the knowledge that I'm gaining here, have a career as an urban planner and acknowledge some of the environmental injustices that New York City and other cities face. So,
I think in my work, I really see myself as someone that's trying to draw that connection to the environment that that person is not seeing. So really giving that moment of joy and making us realize that the environment is around us, whether it's taking just a 10-minute walk to the water body around you. We sometimes forget we live on an island. And here there's this dichotomy in what we always believed the environment is this pristine marine sanctuary that we need, but nature is also right here, like it's in our plaza right here. And I think I really lean on the emotion side, where in a program, if I have 30 kids, if things are going awry and I have all this data to collect, I'm focusing more on let's get wet, let's have fun, and then we'll get into the more literacy side and be able to communicate what this means to our audiences, our families later. But we really all need to first be able to have that connection, and I kind of see myself as that facilitator. So I like playing that role. That's where I feel most comfortable, and I think it's one that we sometimes need in our lives as like just that person to be like, hey, actually, we can just get on a kayak right here and be able to be in our rivers. And that's something that I try to facilitate with whatever my roles might look like. That educator side is pretty hard in there.
Yeah, let me start by saying I really like the mom. In the movie, I was a big fan. And even though my day job is science and data, and I will say I don't quite think it's as simple that there's data and science on one end and art and emotion on the other, right? It's more complicated, but over the last, 5 or 10 years, I've really come to that recognition that it's not about data and science, particularly when it comes to climate change and solutions to climate change. But what we have to do, and I think this has been one of the mistakes of my generation of climate scientists, that we have almost hidden conservatively behind the data and behind the science, and in that fantasy that somehow putting up another graph would convince people or would get the fossil fuel industry to change their mind or, whatever. What I do believe is that what's needed is to get the science out of that ivory tower of the science and connect it to all the aspects, to everything. Get the science out of the science section of the New York Times, get climate change out of the science section of the New York Times, but connect it to every single bit of politics, life, our environment, which that is what it is in the real world. And I think this is that step that needs to be done. And of course, emotion and art is a part of it, but I think it's actually even broader than that we need to bridge that and find that language of bringing actually all of these aspects together.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Obviously storytelling and evoking emotions is the direction I went in my career in life, and that when I started studying environmental studies at UNC, they pushed everyone towards science if you were interested in that, or if you were interested in the environment at all. And I kind of quickly knew that was not going to be my superpower, although there are tons of amazing climate scientists. But some of the most emotional experiences I had were in environmental science classes. I did a coral reef ecology class where we went to St. John, and that evoked a lot of connection. So I don't see them as separated. I do think that there's this kind of mythology certainly amongst the climate movement, which is where I grew up. But also outside of that storytelling is kind of the best form of communications. And one of our advisors is a story scientist, so he studies how different story structures evoke different cognitive impacts. And he likes to say that that's a mythology because storytelling is the only form of communication, because we are interpreting everything through stories we already have in our head or through stories that are told to us. And that's why people at the different end of political spectrums can look at the exact same set of facts and come up with dramatically different interpretations. So so I see them kind of together, but definitely we need more storytellers and artists to evoke more emotions.
Thank you all for sharing this, and it's certainly a spectrum, and the climate world is always trying to learn from other genres of storytelling and communication, and seems always falling somewhat short, since we have yet to accomplish and build a unanimous movement. But one of the lessons from the political world that's often been cited to climate activists is choose a single statistic and build an experience around it in one sentence to communicate a key point. If you think about the State of the Union, each section has 1 or 2 sentences dedicated to it with 1 or 2 statistics. And this was not in the notes I gave everyone to prepare, but I'd like everyone to think about one statistic that sticks with them that they can pull out sometimes. And I'll ask at the end of the panel for you to share that in a single sentence. For now, since this is a panel about youth advocacy, we talk so much about youth activists, we don't differentiate then between old activists, that's not politically correct, but the rest of us are still delineated from youth. So I want to ask our 2 most youthful panelists here, if there was a message that you wanted to say to others, to the non-youthful activists, what would that be, and how would you like to see your worlds and charges overlap? Magnolia, we'll start with you and then go to Danny.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say I think that intergenerational organizing is so important. The youth climate movement is really powerful, but we have to recognize that we didn't start this, and the generations before us, the people who've been doing this work for years, are up against the same systems of oppression that we're fighting against, and so we need to learn from each other. But that being said, I think that something that a lot of the adults that I work with don't realize is that when you're a youth activist and you're in these spaces that are adult dominated, when you're also balancing class and school, it can be hard to be confident and to feel like your voice is valid and your voice is necessary in those spaces. And so everything that adults can do to invite youth into spaces of power and give us a platform and support us in reaching the types of people that make the decisions that are going to affect our future is exactly what we need, I think.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Magnolia said, and intergenerational collaboration is so necessary. Like, we're still in college, we're learning so much, and there's all these wonderful people that have experience out in their careers or from their education, and we have so much to learn from each other. I would also say from our generation, we have all of these different types of tools and spaces. The social media, digital organizing is so impactful, and sometimes older generations don't really know how to interact and use these spaces to the best of their ability. So they also have a lot to learn from us. And I think that a lot of times the youth climate movement does tend to be just young people, but it can be a bit more integrated and collaborative.
So to summarize, we need to be able to provide platforms and integrate and give youth leaders an opportunity to participate and not be tokens or tokenized. And as Magnolia knows, I always go on about the fact that we can't put everything on the shoulders of youth leaders either, because we are the ones who have driven this crisis forward. Now I'll turn to our, shall we say, less youthful activists, not to be ageist in any way, but I think we know who we are, and go towards something either that you have learned from generations before you that has been helpful in your thinking about your advocacy, or something that you think of and would like to see the youth movement doing more of. And start with Shannara.
This is funny because I still consider myself youth.
You are
Yes, I didn't
definitely youth as well, and I was simply separating students
No, you're
from.
good.
I didn't want you to feel unprofessional.
Not at all. This is a hard one. I think because I keep thinking about, I've always just worked with elders. I only work with students in project works and getting them to the platforms and doing my best to listen and just have them take over the high school clubs and things like that, which I'm part of. But I think what I would like to see more and more of is, I think, people being confident in their stories and sharing their experiences as transparently as possible. I think there's a lot of times when, as youth, as somebody who was coming into this field, there were surprises to me, career-wise, navigating it. Now, I just wish I knew some of those things before, when it just comes to, certain ways that you're able to get paid internships versus unpaid. Which spaces can you expect more allies, where not, which in terms of also, I feel like in our worlds, I don't see as many people of color in leadership positions, and that's one thing I would say to people that have been part of this movement longer than me, is how are we trying to bring in as many voices as possible? And we're doing a good job in youth. I feel like we're able to capture more interest and be able to share the stories of people we haven't heard before as much of, but I want to see some of the older people and them sharing their stories as well, and not just the same ones, and bringing up more. So yeah, there's more communication, again, intergenerational work, and that's where kind of the magic lies, for sure.
Excellent. I'm going to jump in here because I realize we're coming up on time, and so I'd like to put out the additional question that I always like to ask, which is, what is it at this moment or on any particular day that you like or would like to invite the audience and their peers to do? And so you can address either of those questions, and then if everyone can go relatively quickly, we'll save time for those sentences at the end. Let's start with you, Anna Jane, and then we can come back this way.
Yeah, in answer to your first one, I think one thing that has really inspired me that the younger generations have brought to light is just embracing the emotional and mental health impacts of this work and being more open about that part of the experience, because I think that is kind of a crisis within a crisis that we need to be addressing, and it very much drives my work with storytelling, because stories are oftentimes how we process, difficult emotions and find courage and solidarity and feel seen. So those are those, I would say that, and then like just kind of something I would love people to do is if you're an artist or a storyteller or filmmaker, please lean more into that. We definitely need more folks who are coming at it from that angle.
Yeah, I'll make it short. I don't have actually advice. I think my main role is just to support what young people do. And we failed, and so that's really how I feel about it. And the last thing I want is to give, the younger people who actually drive this advice. In terms of what to do, I think find community, find friends, have fun, be with people who you like and who you share values with. That's a key point for me. And my sort of favorite organization to do this, where I find that community, is the Climate Museum in New York City, which combines art and climate change, and does this wonderful advocacy. And doesn't shy away from also being, maybe not radical, but at least not, too careful. So climatemuseum.org.
Miranda Massey is a national treasure.
Exactly.
Mine also, find your community in your neighborhood, whether it's you're passionate about compost or you're passionate about birding, whatever it might look like, you are able to make friends and the community builds from there. I think it's helped me professionally as well, where somebody I met just kind of helped me navigate these spaces later in life. And I think that's my biggest advice. And follow that passion, whatever it is that connects you to the environment, and be able to spend time towards it. And I think things organically grow from there.
Danny?
Yeah, my advice is somewhat similar. I'd say with climate activism, usually the people on the ground protesting are what's most visible, but there's so many little tasks that contribute to us creating more positive climate action. So thinking about what talents you have, what skills you can use, and how you can use that to get involved. For example, on campus, I work for the Office of Sustainability. There needs to be someone who puts the waste sorting signs up around campus, or someone who's organizing spreadsheets. Everyone has different talents, and you're able to contribute somehow. You don't need to be out with a microphone speaking in front of a crowd.
Yeah, I agree with everything. And just organizing and taking collective action is the key. And one opportunity that everyone can take here is that on March 21st, there's a National Day of Action being led by Bill McKibben. And everyone can participate. The focus is it's on banks and the role that banks have in funding fossil fuel projects and the climate crisis. And if you're interested, you can go to thirdact.org. You can even calculate how much carbon emissions your money is producing, depending on what bank you use. So that's just an example of one way that everyone can get involved. So I just encourage everybody to find a community, take action, and that's the way that we're going to save ourselves, is organizing.
Thank you, and I agree. I think for all the importance of community, the importance of connecting the dots between the communities we build and supporting each other and finding the skills we can contribute is key, given that we don't have time to build community and then later convert that into action. Now let's go down with the last few minutes we have and start with Anna Jane again. And not to put anyone on the spot, feel free to simply provide a sentence or tell us about a particular piece of legislation that you have your eye on at the moment in the climate world.
So just a sentence of like messaging. Say it one more time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. A sentence that communicates both an emotion and a statistic, a simple statistic, to make a point.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the research we did with USC, which is that only 2.8% of scripted television and film between 2016 and 2020 even mentioned climate change, and we studied 36 related keywords, so it's pretty comprehensive. One way of messaging that has worked very well with storytellers is that we're not asking people to write some sort of new kind of story or new kind of genre. We're just asking people to write stories about what it feels like to be alive right now, because climate is a part of what it feels like to be alive right now.
Perfectly done. Good example. Thank you, Gisela.
I'm going to stay with the theme of the film and the ocean. I am an oceanographer. And I think the ocean is really completely underappreciated in the role that it plays in the climate system, and also in the way it saves us essentially from the effects of climate change. And maybe one statistic to show that with is, right, we all talk about the warming of the atmosphere, of, like temperature increases, but more than 90% of that entire heat that we've generated from climate change is actually in the ocean. So it's only a tiny fraction stays in the atmosphere and has warmed, because the ocean is so good at absorbing heat, and it has warmed way higher, way more than the atmosphere has. So the ocean is super, super, super important.
I also love that every other breath you take is generated by ocean algae. It's overused, though.
And it's wrong.
Oh, see?
I'm sorry,
I'm
I
learning.
might have to.
No, this is important from an oceanographer. Everybody, forget what I have said. This is why I'm moderating and not speaking.
It's true, now I have to say that so that you don't carry the wrong message. So the ocean does generate a lot of oxygen, but it also takes up a lot of that ocean. So we never get to breathe that oxygen. There's just so much exchange. But half of the life on this planet is in the ocean. Half of the productivity is in the ocean itself. That blows my mind every single time.
This is perfect. We have to correct each other.
Exactly. Speaking of biodiversity in the ocean, this statistic always blows my mind. There used to be 220,000 acres of oysters around New York City. So surrounding all the boroughs, you could not step on water without hitting an oyster reef. So keeping that in mind and trying to build our local biodiversity that, we're used to seeing coral reefs in our brains, but these are just a little bit more gray and pale and still bring the similar level of ecosystem balance, and bringing this keystone species is great. So I'll put in a pitch in there for Billion Oyster Project and our oyster little guys who are doing a brilliant job filtering 50 gallons of water a day. They're doing well.
That's 2 statistics, but I'll give it to you.
Sorry. I had to put it in there.
A fact that I would highlight is that people of color and low-income people are disproportionately going to be impacted and are currently being impacted by the climate crisis. So we should really try to highlight and emphasize the voices of people who have experienced environmental racism and prioritize these areas and marginalized groups in climate legislation.
I'm forgetting the name of the researchers, but there was a study of social movements throughout history that found that you only need 3.5% of a population to take action and protest to get change made. So if we want to have meaningful climate action in this country, we need 3.5% of people to be organizing and taking direct action. So I would encourage everybody to think about how they can join that 3.5% or grow that number. It just seems like a small number and very achievable, and something that we can definitely do.
I'll just wrap up by saying that 80% of our national leaders in Congress, 80% of women have voted supportively for climate actions overall. So that's a takeaway versus a much smaller percentage of men. I think you guys all did that really well. And this is an example of storytelling in action, marrying science and emotion. I hope you all go out there and feel motivated to check out the Day of Action, look into each of these brilliant leaders' work, and continue to spread the word. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for our panelists again.